Hi, I'm Zach Walker, and this is the DIUx podcast. I'm joined today by Lauren Schmidt-Dailey and Major David Rothzeid, the architects of the Commercial Solutions Opening, one of the greatest tools that DIUx used to accelerate commercial tech for national security. Lauren and David, thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So if you both could, starting with Lauren, just talk a bit about your background, how you got to DIUx, and what you did in the organization.
Sure. So prior to coming to DIUx, I had spent most of my career in the Pentagon working for the Army as a civilian, doing primarily acquisition headquarters type stuff. So did that from 2009 through 2015. And there was a lot of acquisition reform movement going on then. And I remember working on a project where we got a couple small laws changed to like remove one report, things like that. And really thought that we were, moving the needle a lot in terms of acquisition reform. Then I heard these rumors about this organization called DIUx that the then SecDef Ash Carter was going to open in Silicon Valley. And that sounded really exciting and interesting to me. So I raised my hand, volunteered, interviewed for the job, and got it. So I was the acquisition lead at DIUx from the very beginning. So I started in October of 2015. And I would say for those about first 6 months or so, our mission was, hey, go out and find really cool tech companies, match them up with problems in DoD, connect the dots, and magic will happen, and DoD will all of a sudden have access to all of this great tech that it really needs from the Valley. As you can imagine, things didn't quite work out that way, and that was primarily because the way that the Department of Defense does business primarily is completely at odds with the way that Silicon Valley and these types of truly commercial companies do business. And so for DoD to be an effective customer, we had to find an entirely new way to do business. And that was my job.
David?
Yeah, great. So I am a career acquisition officer in the Department of the Air Force and have started out in Space Command and then moved over to Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, did a stint with SOCOM, and I was at around the 8-year point looking for the next challenge when a friend of mine who was part of the landing committee for DIUx and helping establish it, Adam Gubick, approached me saying, hey, I think your skill set would translate well at DIUx and they need help with acquisition. So 2 weeks after that phone call, I found myself doing a TDY, temporary duty, at DIUx for 3 weeks, working with Lauren Schmidt in January of 2016. I came back and I was so enamored with the mission, continued to moonlight for them. And then through the grace of the general that I worked for at the time, was able to borrow a billet against his Manning document and send it over to DIUx for a 3-year tour. So officially got there in August of 2016. And then just left in September of 2019, spending 3 years learning a lot and working with Lauren Schmidt-Dailey and helping establish that business model that she talked about to help lower the barrier to entry so that we could do work with these firms that are popping up all over the place in the innovation ecosystems like Silicon Valley and the 128 corridor in Austin, Texas, and across this country, really. And then eventually became the director of Pathways and helped establish a couple other programs along the way. And now I'm currently stationed at the Pentagon as the program element monitor for Advanced Battle Management family of systems.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And we will get into much more detail on all those things you mentioned later. But Lauren, first for you. So you got there in 2015, back in what we call the DIUx 1.0 days.
Absolutely.
2.0. And when you say that things didn't work out so well, I assume that was the 1.0 to 2.0 conversion. I know a lot of us know 2.0 is when we introduced the CSO, but at least for me, it just seemed to have come out of nowhere. So where did it come from? Why is it called the CSO? Was that really the reason we went to 2.0, or is it more of an effect of going to 2.0? If you could just speak about that dramatic change, that would be great.
Sure. So even before I came out to DIUx, there had been a change in the law that Congress made that said when you're doing these other transaction agreements and they're successful, you can move directly from prototype to production without having to do another competition for that production award. And that was a really big change because it allowed DoD a tool to cross what we call that valley of death, right? to go from, hey, we've got this great thing that we found and we really want to be able to rapidly deploy and field it. We now have the acquisition tools to do that. So I knew this in the back of my head on the way going to DIUx, and so was always kind of interested in working with OTs. And so over the first like 6 months that I was there, as we're trying to find interesting tech companies with interesting technology, match them up with DoD customers who had needs for that, and just finding that that connective tissue just wasn't forming, right? Because there was no effective way to do business. We figured out that we had to do business fundamentally differently than the DoD had done in the past. Traditionally, DoD is a monopsony, right? A single buyer of things like aircraft carriers, missiles, tanks, things like that. And so as an organization, DoD is used to holding all of the market power. What that means is that we could structure all of the acquisition mechanisms and the way to do business in that market however we wanted, and all of our suppliers would, climb over whatever wall was necessary to do business with us because we were that single buyer and we held all the market power. When you look at a place like Silicon Valley, like any of these commercial tech hubs, right, not only is DoD not the single buyer, but quite frankly, they're not even an important minority buyer. So what that means is that these companies are not going to jump through our hoops to do business with us. We as DoD have to change the way that we do business to be able to attract them. We have to transform ourselves into a competitive customer. And that's what other transactions allowed us to do. They allowed us to be fast, flexible, and collaborative, right? Fast, we could move from putting out a solicitation on the street to actually signing a prototype award in under 60 days. Flexible, because we could put the people that know the problem the best, the warfighters, in the same room as the people who know these solutions and technologies the best, the engineers from these companies, and have them work together to come up with different solutions. And that's that collaborative piece of that, right? We can work together and come up with the best solution that meets our needs. And OTs have been done in the past primarily through consortiums, right? So an OT would be awarded to a consortium, and then that consortium would award specific projects to its members. The reason that I didn't think that that was a good solution for DIUx is that we were the Department of Defense's outpost in the Valley, right? We were out there to say, hey, we're the Department of Defense and we're open for business, come work with us. And I fundamentally felt that we had to be able to work directly with these companies as opposed to going through some sort of a middleman through a consortium. And so that's when we created the commercial solutions opening in the CSO. All the CSO is a competitive mechanism to award OTAs directly to these companies, right, without having to go through a consortium. The fantastic thing about other transactions is that there's not a lot of rules and regulations around how you have to do that. So we were able to create the CSO and the CSO competitive mechanism to match the companies and the types of technologies and the types of people that we wanted to work with in a business model that most closely mirrored the way that Silicon Valley and other innovation hubs do business. And so we kind of designed that from the ground up. We said, how, in a perfect world, how would we want to do business with these companies? How can we quickly narrow from a very large field to a very small one without putting a lot of these companies through, tons of bureaucracy or, writing a 20, 30-page proposal only to immediately get down selected, right? And so we designed the CSO in such a way that we could be fast, flexible, collaborative, and demonstrate to Silicon Valley that DoD was open and serious and ready to do business with them.
How did that come out in DIUx 2.0 or 1.0?
So it's interesting. It was, I was writing it and creating it under 1.0. And then it really, by the time 2.0 was starting, really when Raj Shah came on, that was the first thing that I briefed him on. I said, hey, I've got this idea. It's a way to do business very differently than we've done in the past, that DoD has done in the past. I think it matches up really well. Are you willing to kind of take this risk and take this jump with me? And he saw that and said, absolutely, let's do it. Like full speed forward, full speed ahead. We briefed that all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. And then it was actually the Secretary of Defense who announced the CSO opening when he announced 2.0 as well in Boston.
Oh, wow. Now, in between that transition, DIUx went from being under the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and then moved up to essentially the SecDef level. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we would have been able to launch the CSO had we not been able to move up to that SecDef level?
That's a great question. It certainly helped that we were at the SecDef level because we could directly say, hey, this is something new. We want you to take a risk, and we think that this will work out really well. And to have that direct leadership from Dr. Carter, who was willing to say, yes, we need this so desperately to be able to work with these types of companies. I want you to do something different and take a risk. So having that sort of leadership emphasis from the top, I think was critical in getting us to be able to do something fundamentally different and change the way that DoD does business.
But we still had to play in the rules. And so, David, I want to ask you, as an acquisition officer, from an acquisition standpoint, what did you look at from that perspective in doing the CSO, and also the kind of organizations that we had to partner with to make it work?
Sure. So I think you bring up a really good point in that anytime you're going to develop this business methodology, which is essentially what the CSO as a tool became for DIUx, is understanding who the people are, right? So we obviously, the contingent of DIUx folks and our various backgrounds, both internal to the Department of Defense, but in certain cases, people who have never served in the Department of Defense, either as a uniform wearer or civilian or contractor. You also then had to understand we were doing this, right? We were engaging with these companies for projects on behalf of DoD customers. So being able to empathize and sympathize with what is it that they know about the business process, that will ultimately result in some sort of a project award. Another part, and very important that I'd like to, also talk about is the contracting officers and the culture that they were accustomed to and what it was that we needed to do in order to make sure that they understood the value proposition that something like the CSO would provide. And then finally, as Lauren talked about, right, those industry partners and what are their motivations and incentives for wanting to do work with the DoD. So understanding all of those various attributes or tribes or cultures coming together, you have to deliver a mechanism that provides enough flexibility to win over the hearts and minds of those companies who may not otherwise do work with the Department of Defense, but create some structure to ensure that we are doing our due diligence per, the oath that we take or the strings that are attached with the appropriated dollars that the Department of Defense would have been spending. And that was definitely a huge guiding light for how we created certain processes and did our documentation in order to balance all of those elements.
Gotcha, that makes sense. And then, it sounds like there was a huge amount of stakeholders that had to line up almost perfectly for this to be able to be pulled off. And what part of DIUx was charged with doing this? And really, what was that strategy? Because you had to essentially tell people that what they've been doing their entire career was maybe not wrong, but that there was a better path.
So that was the pathways team at DIUx, which I was the lead of. Originally, it was just me, right? It was the only acquisition person. And I was very lucky to get and hire David, as well as another major, Rob Trejo, to come and join this team as well, of kind of renegades, right? How do we change the way that DoD does business? And fundamentally, that was our job, right? How do we do that in a responsible way that David brought up, right? How do we do it in a way that we don't run afoul of all of the rules and regulations and laws that apply, but in a way that we are pushing the boundaries and trying to do things differently. A lot of what we were trying to do was to incentivize critical thinking rather than compliance, right? To put a lot of the power in the hands of these acquisition professionals, these contracting officers, right? We have an enormous and just wonderful cadre of acquisition professionals in DoD, but too often they're kind of hemmed in by saying, okay, you have to only do it this exact one way and follow this exact rule book, right? The great thing about other transactions is that it allows these contracting officers and acquisition professionals to say, okay, for this particular deal, this particular customer, this particular buy, this technology, this prototype, what is the best way to structure this award to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve? So it really lets them kind of think critically about how do we achieve the best outcomes instead of saying this is, a one size fits all, you must do it this way.
Yeah, that also, if I may add, multiple times people were just like, hey, can you provide me a template? Can you provide me a process, right? And it was that sort of thinking that we wanted to break against. So as much as possible, we tried to balance that structure, right? Along with the flexibility, because the way that OT or one of our CSOs was developed for a specific company in a specific industry may not necessarily conform or comport with the needs of a different. And so ensuring that we build to the necessary level versus take away by exception was fundamental to the way that we approached, as a Pathways team, every element and aspect of the business model, which in a lot of cases culminated with the CSO, but wasn't only about the CSO. And I'm sure Lauren and I would love to elaborate on some of the other elements or execution vehicles that we used during our time at DIUx.
The goal of Pathways as a team was to be, thinking critically about how we can do business better as a department, how we can be an attractive customer to be able to do business with these kinds of tech companies we wanted to work with, right? We were at the same time trying to kind of coach and help through the different program managers who were there, who were executing specific projects through the CSO. But fundamentally, our job was not, hey, let's execute as many projects as we can, but how do we give the rest of DIUx the flexible, innovative, unique acquisition tools that they need to constantly push that boundary farther, right? So the CSO was always designed to be kind of step one in a ever continuing process of making DoD a better customer and more attractive.
Exactly to that point, is what is kind of the menu, and depending on the situation or environment that you find yourself in, identifying the right tool, because even the CSO has certain limitations that may not necessarily be prudent for somebody that's trying to gain a specific effect, right? So if I am trying to experiment with a technology that is provided by a specific company, and I'm not really sure what I'm going to get out of it, maybe doing an entire competition via the CSO is a less ideal way to go about learning about the technology space itself. And so another tool that Lauren, Rob, and I introduced to DIUx and tried to deliver with, pending results was the Experimentation Procurement Authority, right? Otherwise known as 10 USC 2373. It's an authority that's actually been around for longer than OT authority has been, but it's non-competitive by nature. So you can go directly sole source to any company and try out from an experimentation, learn, and then with the expectation that depending on what you learn would help drive the solicitation, that would then allow you to compete amongst many qualified vendors for a CSO.
So you're back in the Pentagon, right? Back in the building doing hard time. You've probably seen CSOs come out across the government. I know the Air Force is a big user of it. What are your thoughts on how the CSO has evolved and is currently being used across the department?
So overall, I'm very enthusiastic. When I left for DIUx back in 2016, the lexicon that we were using in the department rarely overlapped with that of the commercial industry. So the terms that we would use to describe technology often had very hard military jargon. And so, as a consequence of not even speaking the same language, we were unnecessarily walling ourselves off from even having a conversation with the commercial technology. Today, it's totally different. And really, you're the envy if you're a program manager and you're working with some of those Silicon Valley-like companies, right, who are driving the art of technology and things that we're interacting with every day in our personal lives. And even right now, right, under the auspices of COVID-19, where we're doing all of this teleworking, it's become even more paramount that the technology advancements that are occurring in the commercial sector are requiring the DoD to be an even faster follower and adopter of those technology trends. And so coming back 3 years afterwards, I'm seeing a lot of openness, not just from the DoD side, but also from the traditional defense contractors who are also putting forward and trying to move out and help break down some of those barriers that were unnecessarily driving up cost, delaying execution, delaying production, and ultimately, right, providing the warfighters a less great capability than they deserve. And so I think the department, in a large part thanks to DIUx, but also organizations like Defense Digital Service, DDS, and Strategic Capabilities Office, SCO, are helping drive the conversation and move and reform the department to take advantage of that third-party investment that seems to be driving the commercial innovation ecosystem. So specific to CSOs, I'm really enjoying what I'm seeing.
And part of that goes back to training, right? We mentioned acquisition officers and being willing to take the risk because they know that it's okay. David, if you could speak about the training efforts that you launched, and certainly Lauren as well, for your time in DIUx. I know the hacker program was something that you thought would be a way to get acquisition officers upskilled and
Yeah, sure. So I'll definitely talk about the hacker program because I think that it had a really good impact on DIUx as well as the individuals who were selected as part of the program. But even training at a more fundamental level was ensuring that anybody who was new to DIUx got some sort of fundamental training about what the CSO is, how it's different from traditional acquisition, of course, without putting them through like a 3-month boot camp on acquisition 101. But at least to give them some sort of grounding so that they could move efficiently and effectively because a program manager might only do 2 or 3 projects before their time is up, and you can't necessarily wait for them to have all of the lessons learned through experience. Now, more to the fact on the hacker program, the intent was to bring seasoned acquisition professionals and have them do 4-month rotations within DIUx and then chop them out to the portfolio so that they could support the DIUx product managers in the execution, as well as provide some sort of acquisition savvy, as well as learn by the processes that we were doing. The second order effect would be upon their 4-month rotation, they would go back into their home organization and create a little bit of a insurgency, if you will, to help start thinking through how they might do acquisition different. And in a lot of cases, those who have come into DIUx and then gone back out to their home stations have done some incredible things from a novel and execution approach. A third order effect was that we would start to see some of the acquisition talent out there, and in an ideal world, maybe a year or 2 down the road, hire them into DIUx. I was happy to report that hacker number 3/4 is now working as a contracting officer at DIUx. And so I felt like there were a lot of opportunities by engaging with the larger acquisition ecosystem, because while not everybody can have a tour within DIUx because there are limited billets, we might be able to establish a program that could then have people do rotations in and out and help spread the word. But the only way to really understand it is by doing it.
I certainly don't want to give the impression that this is easy or that it was all success. And I want to make sure, David, I give you a chance to talk about production OTs. So for our audience that doesn't know what that means, if you could briefly explain what a production OT is, why it's so special, and then really most importantly, what it was like for DIUx to be willing to do that on behalf of the department and what happened.
Sure. Yeah, so production OTs, it's an interesting and evolving history to date. But essentially a production OT, Lauren alluded to this earlier, that if you award a competitive prototype project, then by statute, you have the ability to award a non-competitive sole source or non-competitive production OT for the scaled capability based on the successful prototype project. So a few years into the execution of CSO projects, a lot of them were finishing and providing extreme utility to the warfighter. And so in partnership with Army Contracting Command New Jersey, who we could not have done this without, we started to take the next step in negotiating some of those prototype projects and talking with the vendors about what does a scaled capability look like. And so the first one that we awarded was to a company called Tanium, and it was for $750 million to recreate the same types of capabilities that we had been prototyping, but not just for the one DoD customer, but as a proxy for the entire Department of Defense. So if you wanted that Tanium-like capability, you could award a task order off of our production OT, and then off you go. It wasn't until our third production OT that we then ran into a bit of a buzzsaw. And the company that was awarded production OT was RainCloud. It was for $950 million, and it was for help migrating our on-prem applications into a cloud environment, right? So as we've seen, and now the whole world seems to be accustomed to, is you are building your applications and orchestrating and managing them in the cloud environment. Back in 2017, 2018, there was some serious direction on behalf of senior leadership in the DoD to start doing it. And we had been doing a prototype project with United States Transcom to help migrate a lot of their applications. And the company RainCloud did it successfully. Unfortunately, right when we awarded the production OT, we were protested. And a few months later, GAO ruled in favor of the protester or sustained the protest ultimately, which had some serious consequences to the department's willingness to move from prototype to production. And so there was a gap, but ultimately DIUx persevered, and a year later started again awarding production OTs. I think when Lauren and I think about the impact that DIUx would have, I was under the opinion that production OTs would become a pretty regular and constant tool as a natural consequence of successful prototype projects. While we have seen different pockets, especially in the Air Force and the Army, leverage it, there seems to be a little bit of resistance and maybe some undue processes put forward prior to making that logical next step as the statute allows. So my hope is that we continue to get more bold and be okay with the possibility of ruffling some feathers with production OTs. The GAO isn't always going to rule in your favor. I have some pretty solid opinions on what I think should have been the outcome. GAO did not agree, but that hasn't stopped the department from moving forward, and I hope that continues.
And I just want to foot stomp what David said, right? From the time that RainCloud was protested to the next time that DIUx awarded a production OT was over a year, right? It might have been even closer to 2 years. That's a really important chilling effect to recognize, right? And that's something that DoD traditionally does, right? Okay, stop, GAO said that we did something wrong, right? Regardless of whether or not you agree with them. And David and I obviously didn't agree with them, but it wasn't up to us. But you can't just stop everything and stop all of your progress and say, okay, time out, like let's go back to doing things the more traditional way. Certainly you want to be circumspect and understand what the best way is to move forward, but you have to be able to ingest those lessons learned and adapt and move forward quickly, not kind of put a kibosh on everything for over a year. And that's something that I would hope in the future that DIUx gets back to kind of that original attitude that we had when we started with the CSO, which was, hey, we know that this is different. We know that some people are not going to like this. We know that we are going to make mistakes and it's going to be a learning experience, but we have to push forward and take those risks. Because if we don't, we're going to keep going back and getting stuck in our traditional timelines and our traditional way of doing business. And we won't be able to work with the companies that we want to work with and get the technologies that we need our warfighters to have by doing things the traditional way.
Lauren, could you speak a bit about the thing that you wish you had known when you got to DIUx, and then also what your most valuable lesson learned was?
Sure. I think they're fundamentally actually the same thing for me, and that is that when I first came to DIUx, I really thought that DoD was kind of the center of the universe, right? So I'd spent all my career in DC, in the Beltway, in the Pentagon, in the headquarters of Army acquisition, right? Fundamentally, DoD was the biggest player in any room that we were in, right? When I came out to DIUx, or really when I moved to California, I remember one of the first things that, you're having small talk with somebody, not a DIUx, but just a random person, and they'd say, oh, where do you work? And I'd say, oh, I work for DoD. And the response was inevitably, oh, I haven't heard of that company. What do they do, right? Which was very different than the response I would have gotten in DC. And that just shows the massive, massive gulf that exists between these two coasts, between these two ecosystems, right? In DC and on the East Coast, DoD is this massive organization and incredibly important, and the work that they do is incredibly important. On the West Coast in California, it's Silicon Valley, it's the venture capital that powers all of these new startups and these massive tech companies that are really creating the next generation of technology that's going to shape not only the way that we live our civilian lives, but fundamentally the way that we fight wars in the future. The massive gulf that exists between these two things has to be fundamentally closed, right? If we're going to move forward as a country and as a nation. When I first came, I did not understand the depth and breadth of that gulf. And I think that was the most incredible and most valuable lesson that I learned while at DIUx was not only the gulf that exists, but how are there different ways that we can cross that expanse and fundamentally bring these two very important cultures, organizations, ecosystems together.
David, over to you.
Well, so too many regrets to name, but ultimately what I take from my DIUx experience was very similar to Lauren, in that there is this larger world and that we just play a part in it. And so now going forward, right, is trying to take everything that I did at DIUx and implement it to the best of my ability, whether it's just having casual conversations with other people inside the Pentagon, or in the case of ABMS, trying to implement some of the best features about DIUx to ensure that we're constantly having those conversations with the best and brightest companies, that we understand the value of the venture capitalist community and the signaling that they do when they make a significant investment in a prescient technology company, and really understanding then the opportunity that a network effect creates. So one big thing that we constantly hear about the stories in Silicon Valley with the successful companies are those that can create that moat where they are the best in town, whether that's kind of like a Facebook from a social media standpoint or a Twitter from a news digest. How do we think about that from a Department of Defense and trying to integrate our technologies for a network effect so that we can gain those effects and really start to spend our funding smartly versus thinking about it as a singular platform?
I would add one other thing real quick too is I think one of the most important lessons I learned from companies and looking at companies and their investors out here is that users are the lifeblood of any organization, right? So all of these companies would kill to have access to their users, to understand what they like, what they don't like, what they need, how they're using their products. DoD is unique in that DoD fundamentally owns their users, right? So DoD has the ability and the capability to inject this user feedback into the acquisition, development, and prototyping and buying and overall process, right, of all of their systems and subsystems and products that we build every day. But we don't do that, right? So that's kind of the fundamental, I think, lesson that I learned out here and hope that I would have for not just DIUx, but the broader department moving forward is how do we leverage the talent and the feedback consistently throughout the product development lifecycle of the users that we own and that we are building these products for.
Building on that, I'd like to ask both of you, if you were back in the saddle, DIUx was about to launch the next big acquisition game changer, what would you make that be?
An aspect of that I would say is find ways to leverage the enormous amount of cash that we have to dual invest in and develop dual use technologies with venture capital companies, right? DoD has an enormous amount of money that we spend on different things. I think if we can marry that up with venture capital investment, we can truly, push things moving forward in terms of the development of the next great dual use type of technology.
Yeah, I might caveat it. Being able to do a cash infusion for promising technology that has a DoD customer, but requires a bridge so that the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution cycle, which is 2 years long, can fill that gap. So right now, if you do a successful prototype project, if the department didn't provide foresight and plan its budget accordingly, you may have a 2-year gap until that customer can actually afford to buy it per the congressional appropriations process. So for me, it would be being able to basically supplement that DoD customer in the short term until the long-term budgets could catch up.
And David, I know that's something you live every day now at the Pentagon. You mentioned briefly what you're doing, but just as we close out, could you speak a bit more about, one, where you are now, and two, how DIUx maybe has shaped what you do day to day?
Sure. Yeah, so I am currently the program element monitor for the Advanced Battle Management System. It is the architecture by which the joint force will be able to connect via a battle network. So in order to really couch it, we typically think about mission capabilities as end items or platforms. So take a fighter aircraft or something like operations center, command and control place. What we don't do a very good job of in the DoD is then ensuring that we can connect all of our disparate capabilities to employ the data that they might be consuming, and then turning it into intelligence to make better decisions. So ABMS is really thinking through that architecture and incorporating best of breed commercial techniques, capabilities, and companies' products in order to create something that you can just easily plug into. You might remember during your early days in the Air Force, the concept of the Air Force gig. It's very similar from a vision standpoint, but we are approaching it in a wholly different way. Instead of a top-down systems approach, we are saying we can be extremely modular. And so from a DIUx standpoint, well, one, I'm trying to broker an arrangement whereby we can leverage DIUx talent and skills and expertise, but also trying to take that same mantra of you are your own entrepreneur, and how can you scale this capability to the largest effect and get that constant iterative feedback through the user community, who are ultimately going to be leveraging it in a battle one day.
Thanks, David. Lauren, you've been out almost 2 years. Where are you now, and how has DIUx shaped what you're doing?
Absolutely. I am at Deloitte now. I'm a manager at Deloitte. I spend about half my time working on OTAs and other types of non-traditional acquisition innovation, right? Deloitte is unique in that it's a firm that actually most of its business is commercial, right? So I think we're uniquely suited to kind of bring a lot of that commercial innovation and commercial approach to the government. And DIUx has obviously shaped a lot of how I think about how we can bring these two different worlds together. So I'm excited to still be on that path and still be supporting. And I would just in closing challenge everybody at DIUx who's there now to kind of think back to the original ways that we were there, right? We were there as an experimental organization to push boundaries and think about new ways to do business and fundamentally get the best technologies into the hands of our warfighters. So if you're not doing something new, if you're not taking risks, if you're not taking a risk of breaking something, you're doing it wrong. And so I would hope that you would continue in that kind of original origin story that we had at DIUx.
That's great. And I'm so glad that you both are still in the fight in some capacity. David, any closing comments?
I can't say it any better than Lauren does, so I think we'll just leave it there.
I can't either, so we'll just have to end the episode. Lauren Schmidt-Dailey, Major David Rothzeid, thank you so much for joining today. Thank you for what you did for DIUx and for the nation, bringing us the CSO, and for what you're doing now.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Zach. It's always a pleasure.